right. Hey, you guys. Welcome back to the mass exposure. For all of you that were
Presented by.
listening, presented by the Mass Exodus.
Yes. Perfect.
And I'm here obviously with Rob Gregerson, Katie, and Ian, all my lovely people. Picking up from our last episode, we are doing the 12 steps from AA in the big book, and we're taking these one by one. This episode's going to be episode 4. I don't know why my crew decides to give me all these emotional ones, because for those of you who listen to us regularly, you know I'm going to cry.
Yeah.
But
I mean,
moving
it's just,
forward,
it has to work that way.
it just goes.
Somebody
that
has
way.
to cry.
Yeah.
I will be that person. I'll fall on that sword. So today's episode, we're going through, like I said, the 12 steps of AA, and we're doing step 4. And I'm just going to read step 4 and we're going to jump into it because it's a big one. Made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. I would just like to say, for some reason, just as I read that, it's the first time I realized it says fearless. Fuck no, I am not fearless in this step. I am scared to death. This is a heavy one for me. It's hard to look in that mirror, and I always like to think of myself as a pretty moral driven, do the right thing kind of girl, and Lord knows I've not always been that best person. So it's all on you guys now.
I don't think fearless really is a part of, I think fear is definitely a big part of this step.
I think fear is a part of all of the steps, but to have it so blatantly in our face of fearless, ugh.
I think it doesn't mean that you can't initiate this step until you're fearless. I think what it means is that you need to be fearless in your fact-finding and fact-facing process in this step.
Dig.
You need to
dig. Do we want to think of fearless then as blatantly honest?
I suppose, yeah.
Yeah.
Same
get
thing.
The shovel. You got to get the shovel to uncover it all.
Unfortunately, it's kind of like a major, like you can't withhold some things in this step. You have to identify everything that has occurred to the best of your ability.
Turn to that mirror.
Terrifying. So,
and my mirror had a big old magnifier.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So that goes to my question. Like, for those of us who have done these steps, my therapist continues to ask me, do I journal? Do I want to journal? That's a little scary for me. Like, when we're doing this moral inventory, should we write it down? Like, can I secretly go through my moral inventory in my mind, Ian, and just not admit this to other people? Like,
it's a good question. It's a question that I have brought up in the past, where I didn't know if I was being fearless in my endeavor with this step if I hadn't been able to write it down like I was told to do.
It makes me think, to go to the mass exodus part, it makes me think of confession as a Catholic. And
I think
hard.
of it, I would try to think of it as trying to, an analogy from the past, like a murder corkboard. You're trying to understand who's connected to who with the yarn and the needles, right? Like you're trying to identify, what did I do? Who did I do it to? And how did it affect me? And then how did it potentially affect them? And then
I love that. That makes it feel less scary.
Yeah.
With how you just explained that.
I mean, in the book, it showcases 3 columns, right? The first one is I'm resentful at. Then the second column is the cause. And then the third one is affects my, right?
Yeah.
So it's really just taking, doing a massive data dump of everything that's happened to you, that you perceive has happened to you from your perspective.
I had 3 spiral bound notebooks, college lined, double sided.
Yep.
Where I followed my sponsor's direction and listed my resentments of people, institutions, principles, ideas, events. And then, like Ian said, you do the cause. And I wrote down, like, because I couldn't remember some of the things which part of you it affected. So it was like self-esteem, your personal relationships,
right? Sex
material,
relations,
sexual relationships, your emotional, your social, your security. And then the turnarounds were where you look at your responsibility in the matter, in that resentment.
right?
Where was I to blame? Where was I selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, fearful, or inconsiderate? Who did I hurt?
Guys,
what should
I
I
feel
have
like
done?
that's my whole life, though.
It is.
Oh, it is.
That's the point. That's why she has
That's
3
not
spiral
what you were
notebooks.
supposed to tell me.
It's so fucking scary.
This step is so overwhelming because we talked about our last episode, we are so hard on ourselves. And do I list where I cut that person off on the street? I didn't mean to. I didn't see them. But to me, that's a moral, like, I try to be on this high horse, which is a weakness, and I shouldn't have done that. Do I list that? And then
if it comes up,
if it's affecting you, then yes.
Really shitty thing where I said something, and this is, I feel like I need to verbally admit this. I had a very tough situation over this last year where I was very intoxicated. And I said some not nice things to somebody that I absolutely adore.
Yep.
I have forgiven you.
Thank you, Rob.
You're welcome.
It's that kind of moral inventory that.
Right.
Yeah.
And fuck, if it I don't want to be that person.
You write it down.
So I'm just going to read something from the book here. It says, we started upon a personal inventory. This was step 4. A business which takes no regular inventory usually goes broke. Taking a commercial inventory is a fact-finding and fact-facing process. It is an effort to discover the truth about the stock in the trade. One object is to disclose damage or unsellable goods, to get rid of them promptly and without regret. If the owner of the business is to be successful, he cannot fool himself about values. We did exactly the same thing with our lives. We took stock honestly. First, we searched out the flaws in our makeup which caused our failure. Being convinced that self manifested in various ways was what had defeated us. We considered it its common manifestations. Resentment is the number one offender. It destroys more alcoholics than anything else. From it stem all forms of spiritual disease, for we have been not only mentally and physically ill, we have been spiritually sick. So this whole step really is taking an inventory of how have we been affected by the world, and how have we affected our perceptions of those actions. Like how have we affected ourselves? And oftentimes it comes down to a lot of resentment, a lot of fear, a lot of just a lot of negative things, that direct my everyday life.
What we talked about in the last episode bleeds perfectly into this for me, because I didn't like hearing Ian talk so bad about himself. But when I'm doing this moral inventory,
there you go.
My struggle.
Right.
I need to find the ability to give myself some grace, but I also need to be very honest that some of these things I did were wrong and they were not good. And I struggle in general to come to that balance of trying to forgive myself, but still remember what I did was not okay.
Yeah, you haven't had I can understand why this is so scary, and you just kind of said this, but you haven't practiced taking moral inventory without being kind to yourself. So why would you want to do this? Because it's just kind of going back into a cycle of, negativity.
I'm a piece of shit.
And all of that, that stuff.
Hey,
And
you can't say that yet.
I was waiting for you to pick up on that. That was a long delay, Ian.
Yeah, you can't say that yet.
But that's good news, because that teaches us right there in the moment that we can do this. We can have a moral inventory and we don't have to beat ourselves up.
Can we?
Yeah. You know who says, can we? Is the person who's like stuck into the cycle of, hopelessness and doesn't believe they can.
For our listeners, I'm raising my hand right now.
I know.
Which is why I keep saying these steps are so hard for me, because I'm literally in this moment and it's scary.
What's scary about it?
I'm taking some moral inventory.
You just took
I'm taking
inventory.
some moral inventory.
Right.
And what I just admitted to, that situation, I feel like a piece of shit. And I would never intentionally do that. But this is where I was intoxicated. So do I allow myself to make that quote unquote an excuse? I would never do that. My sane person. Is that where the question comes up of alcoholism, to where it has taken over? It's taken me over, where it's going back to step one, unmanageable. To me, that situation was unmanageable. And I have the guilt and I have the remorse. And there's a resentment of myself for being that person.
I mean, to me, I'm not really comfortable going this direction, but it sounds like you're afraid of how this represents you as a human, right? Like, how does this affect my moral justness amongst my others?
Let's take me out of this, because Ian, I don't want to make you uncomfortable.
No,
I don't want this to be like all about me. But when people are doing this step, I feel like the questions that I'm asking are some very common questions, and it's fear driven.
Right.
And we even talked about this in the last episode. Fear it affects all of these things when we're looking at them.
Right. The point is to be able to put it down. Right. Like
put all it down and let go.
All of these. No, not there yet.
Okay.
No, we're not there yet. We just need to be able to put it down, because like, write it down, jot it down, type it out, memo it on your phone and catalog it, which is what I did. That's the point of this step. It's not to figure out yet why or how it affects us or whom it affects. It's just about your list of who made us angry, what was the situation, why did it affect me, in your own thoughts. It's getting a baseline vital, right? It's you going into the doctor, you don't feel well, the doctor doesn't know who the fuck you are. They need to perform some tests to understand what's a baseline
before they try to fix it.
Right?
This is one of our tests. This is one of our litmus
This is
tests.
the test for you with your fellows to now look back on and say, oh, wow, I'm starting to see some signs of, some irregular heartbeat, AKA you're fearful, it's just a baseline. It's not meant for for anybody to, use this as, like,
judgment-free zone.
Exactly. Judgment-free zone.
It's just not get it down. If it's coming up, put it down. If you've been carrying it around, write it down. For years, this process took me 2 years with my sponsor.
Same.
And I called her almost every day. Some days I avoided it because I'm a procrastinator and a perfectionist. And some days it was just too freaking hard. And we came up with a number of that I would have to write a day, like 3 or 5. I forget the exact number.
Right.
But it was like, okay, do you think you could write 3 a day down?
Right.
I was like, okay, maybe I could do that. I could handle that. Like, because it is heavy. It is a lot. You're digging up some really poignant and hard truths about your story and trauma, and It's a marathon. There's not a race, because there's sometimes people are like, oh, I did it in a year. And like, you could fall into the comparison trap, but take it as it comes. Me too. Take the time that you need, take the pauses that you need. And the more you do it, it becomes like a habit. And that was my biggest takeaway, was the turnarounds.
Right.
For this step. That was the biggest thing for me, was seeing my responsibility, because I never did that. And now when things happen, I can use that, because I still am resentful. I'm still feel fearful. I'm still inconsiderate,
I do mini lists now, like once I wrote down my lists, it's not like, okay, I'm perfect from now on. No, no, I write down lists like weekly, oh, my wife, finished a very poignant part of my story that I was very emphatically telling to my friend, and she stole my thunder. What a bitch. I write that down, and then I start to. Then I have the ability to analyze it. Oh no, she's not being a bitch. She's just as excited about it as I am. I'm ununderstanding of how interested she is in the things I'm interested in, and I'm creating a narrative that's not true to the situation. And why is that?
RhiAnnon, I think that sometimes, or a lot of us, and I relate to this with you, that we believe our actions are tied to our worth. Yeah. And we don't want to approach this moral inventory list, because the more we see, if we have that belief system, the more we see of what we have done, how the morals we have broken is a reflection on us. And I do think it's important. You and I have talked about this before. I think it's important to figure out the practice as you are approaching the step, to know you're a good person, and this is part of being human. Part of being human is error. It doesn't make excuses. It doesn't mean we lean back on that and we just say, we're all pieces of shit, or whatever the case is. But we approach this with a kindness towards ourselves, but also an honesty. You know what I mean?
And that's where, for those of our listeners who listened to the last episode, I feel like that's the struggle for me in all of these steps. And you're right, Rob, I tie this to my self-worth. In saying that, though, I am doing my best to always try and come up with that silver lining. And as I'm verbally processing this with you guys, and I'm taking some of this moral inventory, I want this to be a positive, because I know that I don't want to repeat these scenarios. I want to grow, and I think we all want to progress and be better. And in taking this moral inventory, I think it's a really good thing to recognize this and make it that learning experience. And the positive being, what can I do to ensure that I don't have these actions again in the future?
I would be cautious about trying to thwart these from being occurrences that pop up in the future. We're human.
Mm-hmm. I'm not going to say that it's not going to happen, but if we're going to get to the brass tacks of this with Alcoholics Anonymous, this is the question of, is this unmanageable to the point where I need to think about how I can prevent this in the future?
I think that you're setting yourself up with that statement to put yourself down again in the future.
Ugh. So what do we do? And again, I want to take sometimes I want to make I statements, and in this situation, I don't want to make this about me, but I also don't think I'm the only one in this struggle right now.
This program is somewhat clinical in its approach, because they're trying to somewhat separate you from the emotional hurdles that you might impose upon yourself that have tripped yourself up in the past. Yeah. And this step in particular, like Katie had mentioned, she had a sponsor to provide her with suggestions and guidelines, and she, her sponsor was flexible but still unwilling to take, some bullshit. Like, no, you've got to come up with some of them. Are we good with 3 today? So left to our own devices, I don't think I would be able to do this step by myself.
I was just gonna say,
I wouldn't be able to do this because
this is not
it's
something
self-preservation
by yourself.
Right.
Yeah. You have to have a community or a sponsor or somebody, because left to our own devices, these steps can be really tough.
Right.
Oh God, yes.
Right. This step is the hardest. This is considered maybe one of the harder steps.
Yeah.
My sponsor heard every single darkest truth, and she witnessed me figuring things out about some trauma that I experienced that I didn't uncover before in therapy.
That's uncomfortable when you don't even know that you're trying to hide it.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I know what I'm trying to hide, and I'm pretty good at hiding it. And I guess I'm okay with letting you know a little bit about it, I guess.
Right.
But the things that you don't even know about, and then you both are there for that, like that's another level of trust.
In part of this process, and I think this is very individual for everybody, do I need to basically confess this?
It's not about confessing it, right? It's just about itemizing it.
The clinical part.
You're not telling on yourself.
That's what it feels like.
I mean, who are you telling if you would be telling on yourself, the only person you're telling on yourself to is you. Like, your sponsor is not there to, a sponsor wouldn't be there, or another individual, say, not a sponsor. But
we're our own worst critics. And that's where I feel like we need that community. Because Ian, the last episode I meant to come down pretty hard on you. Like, you're being really hard on yourself, because we are always going to I am always going to judge myself the hardest.
I think that's normal for everyone.
Yeah.
But that's what I mean. Like, it's a slippery slope, because I'm a little overwhelmed by this step.
No, I think a lot of people get overwhelmed by this step. This is not something that it's totally normal for this step to be overwhelming. And just as a notation, having gone through this clinical process where you identify everything that you felt has, somebody who's wronged you, or a situation that has wronged you, or an institution that has wronged you, you start to, and then you do the analysis, you start to see some patterns. Okay. And those patterns are core deficits, core defects that you have, whether that be a situation that came from your past because of how you were grown up, or not. I mean, likely it is, but that doesn't change the fact that you are still perpetuating those core defects. And it's not about hating on yourself. This step is hard to do without that.
That is exactly it.
This step is a very emotionally taxing and tiring step.
There's a lot of gray area in the step, and it becomes very individual because we all treat ourselves so different. And I guess that's where I still, to our listeners, some of the things we talk about on this podcast, these are not things that you go alone on.
No.
You just can't.
Yeah, no.
Never, no. I would not
recommend Rob,
that.
I know, like, our whole goal for this podcast is creating a certain community, and this step just makes me cling to you guys and to our community. It's a lot.
It is.
Well, yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, my sponsor is still she became like a best friend. I can tell her anything.
Right. And in my situation, I had the really terrifying experience of knowing a couple years before that my sponsor was going to die. And all of the things that I had confessed to somebody and finally had trust in was going to disappear eventually. And
having like you start over again.
And having to come to terms with, wow, I'm being really selfish with this.
Yeah.
Wow.
There comes that word again, selfish.
I'm being really selfish because I don't get what I want. When in reality, I need to be there for this person because I was just as much of a support for him as he was for me. So there are things that happen, right? And I think that having a sponsor is a huge step, or a person that understands these steps pretty in-depthly, is a good person to have in your corner when going through this, because they've gone through it too. It's not a teacher and a student. It is two individuals walking in the same direction at different places on the path. And you guys have walkie-talkies and you're keeping in contact with one another. Hey, I tripped over that log a couple of feet back. FYI, there's a log there. Okay. I can deal with that. I can deal with that obstacle. It needs to be done. We need to be able to identify where we are uncomfortable. What's rubbing me the wrong way? Because without that, you're just, it's too big of a ball. This is the first step in unraveling that huge ball of yarn. And like we talked about previously, you got to start with you. And eventually you'll get to analyzing this, right? Like you first have to write it all out, and then you're going to analyze it and talk about, wow, yeah, this person legitimately did really kind of screw me over. Now, what do I do with this? Or, wow, no, this person really didn't screw me over, and I perceived that they did. This is mine. So it's just, you got to categorize it. Got to delineate between whose part is whose. First part is not being the victim anymore. And I'm not saying that the history that you have as a child or past, doesn't play a part. It plays a huge part. And I went back as far as I could remember, And there were some times when I was, 4 or 5, and I'm like, this really shaped me.
I'm thinking of, again, our listeners or anybody else who's going through this. And I appreciate how you kind of said it's very clinical. I want to hold on to that because I need to be clinical when I'm taking this moral inventory. The first step is getting it down, like you said. Like, let's not put, what's the saying? The cart before the horse.
Right.
Like, let's take this clinically one step at a time and not get overwhelmed. And I think right there, that realization makes this a little less all-consuming.
Yeah, because you go back once you get everything down that you feel is everything. Then you go back.
And then you start the emotional part of it. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think I immediately, when you said, is this like confession? I was like, oh, there's her religious past that just came in. Like,
and I wasn't even Catholic.
Religious. The confession thing goes way beyond Catholicism, but
it's true.
I'm repeating myself from the last episode, and I'll continue to repeat myself about this idea of things being a symptom versus the cause, because I think it's really important to look at it like that. That actually brings in a practice of self-kindness in this, which is, I did this, and even though you're not figuring out why you did this yet, I did this. Well, there's probably a very human thing behind it. You know what I mean? And then you take your worth out of it. Then you take all of that out of it. And it's like, like I wish I had an example off the top of my head. Maybe I need to do my own inventory to sort of understand it from my own perspective. But, there's just some behaviors that, okay. So if you get married, you will probably at some point, if you want your marriage to survive, you'll be taking a moral inventory because you need to know why there's shitty things that are happening between us.
Yeah.
And and I have that happen all the time with Lynn's, which is like, you know, we evaluate what happened. We take a moral inventory after we had some kind of spat or somebody reacted something real quickly and it just seemed kind of out of nowhere. She's really good at leading us down that path of like, okay, well, why did this happen? And then it becomes less of like, I did this because I'm a bad person. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Go and try to live perfectly morally. Try it for one day. Go and try to do that. Impossible. Yeah. Does that make you a bad person during that day? No. You know? So actually,
it's a human.
Yeah. And in some ways, I actually look at this. I have done this step before, and I actually look at it as like freedom. It's like the opportunity to sort of take all of this stuff off that we've been so weighed down by.
Exactly.
So how about turning it into a positive and saying, oh, sweet, I don't have to be weighed down by this stuff anymore, but let's take a look at it. Totally switch the perspective on it.
Yeah. I love that.
And so, you can, by the way, that's not something that's like, oh, it's just this long journey to try to, no, put it into practice now.
Right.
Hey, this is a good thing.
So there's this phrase right here. I'm just going to keep going to the book because this is perfect. It states, we turned back to the list, for it held the key to our future. We were prepared to look at it from an entirely different angle. We began to see that the world and its people really dominated us. In that state, the wrongdoing of others, fancied or real, had power to actually kill. How could we escape? We saw that the resentments must be mastered, but how? We could not wish them away any more than alcohol. This was our course. We realized that the people who had wronged us were perhaps spiritually sick. Though we did not like their symptoms and the way they disturbed us, they, like ourselves, were sick too. So it's identifying some of the key obstacles that we need to overcome. And it's for a lot of folks who have gone through it, it's like when I first jumped out of an airplane, I felt a liberation almost as good as I felt after I did this step.
Yes.
But the fear of getting all the gear on and going through the process of hiking up the elevation in the plane, all of that was so terrifying that I'm like, I'm going to die from this. Mm-hmm. But then as soon as you jump and you get on the ground, you're like, holy shit, I need to explain this to other people. Mm-hmm. But, you know, I had somebody there. I had somebody who had done it before me. Right? And there are people doing it after me. So, this isn't, I urge you to not feel like this is something to be, I'm a piece of shit in a negative sense, but to understand that being a piece of shit sometimes is just part of being human. Mm-hmm. And that identifying that is how we start to understand who we are as a human under the circumstances that we've been under from the past to this current moment. And how do we alter how we interact with our surroundings and our fellows so that we can start to change a little bit from here on out. That doesn't mean that we're not going to revert. Sometimes we always revert. And that's why these steps are continually, reworked.
And you can do it more than once.
Yeah.
I haven't done them again since, but my husband's done it multiple times. And like when I was going to burn those books because I found, but then I ended up just ripping all the pages and recycling them. I don't know why that felt better than burning. But I didn't need to carry them around anymore. It was like they used to have power over me. Every single thing that I wrote down in those books had power over me. And by writing them down and doing the process of turning it around, I was taking my power back. And I was also learning how not to fall into the patterns that were not serving me anymore, that I wanted to change, but would always fall back into. And those patterns are still.
Yeah. You know what it makes me think of too is like, if you start creating your list, sometimes you'll look at it and go, it's not as bad as I thought it was. Like you can even sometimes get some laughter out of it. It was like, I blew this thing up in my mind for so long, and I put it out on paper and looked at it, and it was like, oh my gosh. Like,
so true.
Silliness. Sometimes
mountains
it's terrible. And and sometimes there are mountains there. You'll look at it and go, oh God, I don't want to stare this. You know what I mean? But like when it stays in our head and it just controls us like a marionette, you know, it can get out of perspective.
Right.
And
I remember,
I
remember I would meet my sponsor at Crossroads Mall.
Oh yeah, I know Crossroads.
It's
not open anymore,
in Bellevue.
right?
Oh,
it
yeah,
is open. I go to that Michael's all the time.
I used to work at that Michael's. Oh God.
Really?
Anyway,
small world.
Yeah, it is. So I would go to Crossroads Mall with my sponsor, and I would be writing out stuff and this was when I was trying to write out stuff. I realized, wow, I'm really not having luck with writing out stuff. So, but I was writing out some of these things, and in walks like maybe 4 or 5 like notations prior. In walks the very person that was written about. And it was an old girlfriend of mine that I had just ghosted. Because I was like, man, I'm not a good person. And I don't want this person to be tainted by who I am, because I'm not going in a good direction. And so I legitimately was like, it was a somewhat selfless act, but in a very detrimental outcome. And she walked in and we locked eyes, and she immediately looked away, and I've never seen her again. And it was a pretty hard blow, but it was something that needed to happen. It was like, okay, I was faced with the legitimate outcome, effect of what I had done. And in this process, it's super healing. If you're able to get through it,
and just to identify it,
right? Like I didn't even have exactly. I didn't have the tools. Like I looked at my sponsor and I'm like, oh my God, look, that's X. And he's like, wow, you just wrote her down. I'm like, yeah. He's like, what do you think you should do? I'm like, I think I'm going to go over there and apologize. He's like, well, what the fuck are you going to tell her? And I was like, well, I'm going to apologize for this, this, and this. And he's like, is that really what you want to apologize for? Mm-hmm. Like, is that really going to help her? And that brings us to another spot. The next part of this, well, not the next part, but a part in this is amends. And
I was just
the scary one. Everybody,
that's a scary one.
Like scary.
And you don't make amends to somebody if it's going to hurt them further.
Yep.
Yeah.
And he was like, you know what? I think that this situation is a living amends situation where you don't necessarily do anything other than try to live your life differently so that you do not do that again to somebody. And maybe things will work out between you both.
We've all done therapy, right?
Yeah.
Some sense. Yeah. And I really tend to love when I come out of a therapist office, because it was just, we didn't fix anything. Most therapists, good therapists, won't try to fix anything. They're basically helping you, lead you through your moral inventory, and knowing that your life will naturally grow in fixing it, probably, if you can take some of this stuff off. But I would say if you're in therapy, understand that you're already practicing it.
Right.
You know what I mean? This is a practice of that. And I'm trying my hardest not to look at you, RhiAnnon, because I don't want this episode to be just like, we all ganged up on RhiAnnon. She put herself out there and we all gave our perspective. But
I will never feel that way.
Can we call it a spiritual gangbang?
Oh, That went to such a different level.
I used to call group hugs Christian gangbangs. So
this is where that dark humor comes in, listeners.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I love it.
But just remember that if you are in therapy, this has already been a practice that's starting.
Mm-hmm.
I know.
You're working with somebody on it. You know, you're laying it out there.
Right.
And,
right.
You know, yeah.
This step's hard, RhiAnnon.
It is.
And if listeners, like, I don't really know I don't know what we could say to help direct you with the step if you don't have a sponsor or a trusted advisor, like a therapist, to work through this step with. But I also don't want this to be like cordoned off for only those individuals, right? Like, not every one of our listeners is going to have that in place right now. And so maybe I would suggest maybe not working this step yet.
Yeah.
But I would very much so suggest you have somebody that you are comfortable with, who can push you a little bit to do this, because I didn't want to do this. I still don't like doing this. And if I didn't have somebody pushing me, for instance, I need a new sponsor. Any sponsors out there? I'm dying. I need your help. Thank you.
Yeah.
Ian, you and I need to get to a meeting. We'll find you a sponsor.
You know,
actually, that's a good idea.
You know, another
Find me a sponsor.
Another freeing thing of doing this with somebody who has done it or is ready to do it is you put it out there. You put some of these, I don't know, quote unquote, toxic behaviors or bad behaviors out there, things you're ashamed of. And then you suddenly realize everybody relates to it. Like, I'll give you guys an example. So I will play the role of the guy who shares everything on this podcast. People already know that I masturbate and lie about it. They know that I, yada, 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 because I put it out here. Well, I'm going to share with you listeners about what happened right before this podcast, which is I had a really rough night of sleep. And I knew why I had a really rough night of sleep, but I was so afraid to tell my compadres here of like why I had a rough night of sleep. And the reason I had a rough night of sleep is because I'm getting erections at night that are keeping me up. Okay. So I think about like, should I share this with them or not? Like, we're already in the topic, and I was just like, fuck it, I'll share it with them.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
What did you think was the cause? And why were you so afraid to share this with us?
Right. Well, one, I feel stupid. Like, I feel like an idiot, and I don't want to look more like an idiot, which tends to be the reason I think a lot of people don't want to tell like the things they're ashamed of or whatever. Three, the thing that always brings me into those, like sharing that stuff, is if it makes people laugh. I love seeing people laugh. And if they laugh on behalf of me, that's even more awesome. And it's my way of getting through the shame. So anyway, back to the scenario. I told these guys this, and they were all like, isn't that normal? I was like, no, I'm 42 years old and I'm acting like I'm a 14-year-old teenager. And it was just
Wouldn't
like,
most men kill for that?
yeah, exactly. You're doing what I'm saying, which is like, I'm so ashamed of this thing that I'm keeping it in. And actually it might just be normal. You know, listeners, I could have used a better example than what I just used, but it just happened. And so my point being is like, you know, like sometimes it's not as bad as we think it is, or more people can relate. And even more than that, when we bring this stuff out, it invites other people to go, oh, I have held on to that for so long, and I want to be able to release that too.
Right.
You know, so I don't know. There's so much good that comes out of it, even though that jumping out of the plane and admitting that you have boners at night as a 42-year-old is pretty scary. But then you let it go and you're like, it's fun. It's funny, you know, like, and it's natural and it's okay. So anyway.
I wouldn't be concerned if I didn't get boners at night.
Really?
Yeah.
Is this how we're going to end on this thing?
I really hope not.
This is we're
I
kind of
don't
coming
know.
up on the
It feels
ending
like
time.
a good ending. What?
An end to
Why
a
not?
beautiful story about people
Boners.
who you have resentments
anyway.
against.
Get where I'm
Being
coming
vulnerable.
Yeah, I know for sure. Being
There we
vulnerable.
go.
And that
Oh.
actually, Katie, you just named it, which is this involves being vulnerable. And it's really hard to be vulnerable when you don't feel safe, even if it's with yourself.
Exactly.
Boom.
Exactly.
Vulnerability involves you being affected. You can't, you're not protecting yourself anymore. And you're putting yourself out there. But let me tell you, when you go into vulnerability, there is no thrill. There's nothing as thrilling as it is, as when you're falling from the airplane.
For sure.
You know what I mean?
For sure.
So
Yeah. Agreed.
I guess my encouragement to us and to the listeners is, yes, this is a tough step, but I'm telling you, there's so much freedom in this step. And it's way better than holding on to this stuff, even if it's scary to originally admit it.
You're not alone.
Yeah, you're not alone.
Not alone.
And this step,
Not alone.
I love the way that you put that. This step was like the needed fuel that I felt I was missing throughout my entire life. I became such a much more productive individual. It was just like night and day. When I was able to shed all of this weight, just I don't know, the agility that comes from this to move forward with your growth is exponentially greater than when you're trying to work through like a therapist meeting or working with friends, and you've got all this baggage. It's like, man, we've seen it before where we're emotionally distraught to the point where we really can't work through what we can't focus on what we're trying to focus on because we're so emotionally distraught by all the past. So dropping all this stuff really provides you with some clarity.
I think that's a great note to wrap this up. I also want to say, just talking about this in this episode makes me feel a little bit lighter. And I hope for our listeners that our conversations and the things that we put out there helps them to feel a little bit lighter in their day also.
Can I give a parting word, which is, I just want to acknowledge how awesome that is, RhiAnnon, that you brought yourself forward as somebody that we could have as an example to talk about. Like, that's not easy. And I hope that people who are listening to this, through RhiAnnon kind of showing her, bearing herself right now, that you also understand that that's okay, and none of us are judging her right now in the recording. But there's a lot of freedom in that. And she just explained that. So I wanted to thank you, RhiAnnon, for doing that. And also just, I'm so thankful and grateful. We've talked about this quite a bit from all these recordings about diving into this, and allowing the burdens to come off and looking at stuff, even if it's hard to do. But yeah.
I love you guys so much. Like, this,
Love you too.
this means so much to me. And I hope that our listeners feel that where we're coming from is very honest, and we just want to help everybody. Like, we just want to be there for each other.
Not everybody, but most people.
On that note, thank you, listeners.
Not everybody.
Transition.
Oh
All right.
my gosh. Okay, bye.
Love you guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.